At 2:31 p.m. on January 3, 1944, Greg "Pappy" Boyington became a ghost. High above Rabaul Harbor, the most heavily defended Japanese fortress in the South Pacific, the fuel gauge on his F4U Corsair didn't just hit the red line. It slipped past the E, past the metal pin, and settled into a void where physics said the engine should have already stopped. In the cockpit of a fighter plane, there is no sound more terrifying than the silence of a dead engine over an open ocean. But for Boyington, the silence wasn't coming from the wings. It was coming from his radio. He clicked the mic. Static. He slammed his palm against the instrument panel, hoping to jar a vacuum tube back into place. Nothing. The squadron frequency was a graveyard. His black sheep, the misfits and outcasts he had spent months turning into the most lethal pilots in the Pacific, had vanished into the clouds. He was 30,000 feet up, alone, with a dead radio and a fuel tank that was essentially a vacuum. But the real disaster was happening inside his flight suit. Boyington's hands were trembling, a fine rhythmic stutter that he couldn't suppress. It wasn't the 50-degree below zero air at altitude, and it wasn't the fear of the 40 Japanese Zeros currently spiraling up from the airfields below like a swarm of angry hornets. It was the dry tremors. He hadn't touched a bottle in 48 hours, and his central nervous system was beginning to collapse. Every time he tried to level the wings, the Corsair bucked. His brain was screaming for a drink, and his body was threatening to shut down just as the most dangerous air battle of his life was beginning. To the brass at Marine Command, this was the inevitable end of the Boyington problem. They had called him a brilliant drunk, an unstable liability, and a man who was more dangerous to his own side than the enemy. They had expected him to burn out. They had expected him to fail. And as 3 Zeros began to bracket his position, it looked like they were finally right. The Japanese pilots didn't see the legendary ace of the VMF-214. They saw a heavy, sluggish brute of a plane that was drifting off course, piloted by someone who seemed to have lost his grip on the controls. They didn't dive immediately. They measured him. They circled, watching the Corsair's inverted gull wings wobble in the thin air, waiting for the exact moment the fuel ran out, and the whistling death turned into a 10-ton glider. The Zeros peeled off, one high, two low, forming a textbook kill zone. It was a mathematical certainty. In 6 minutes, Boyington would be out of fuel. In 10 minutes, he would be at the bottom of the Pacific. But Greg Boyington didn't live his life by textbooks, and he didn't fight by the rules of the living. He didn't fire his guns to clear his tail. Instead, he did the one thing the Japanese hadn't calculated for. He didn't try to save his fuel. He slammed the throttle into war emergency power, shoved the stick forward, and plummeted into a vertical suicide dive toward the harbor. He wasn't trying to escape. He was using the last of his energy to force the Japanese into a fight they weren't prepared for. A fight where the only thing that mattered wasn't fuel or altitude or even sanity. It was the math of the kill. And Pappy Boyington was about to show them that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous variable in the sky. The Corsair didn't just fall, it screamed. This was the whistling death, a nickname the Japanese had given the F4U because of the air induction slots in the wing roots. But at 450 miles per hour, that whistle had sharpened into a high-pitched metallic shriek. The airframe was vibrating so violently that the instrument needles were blurring into gray circles. Compressed air was slamming into the rivets with the force of a sledgehammer, testing the overbuilt philosophy of the Chance-Vaught engineers. Boyington sat in the center of that chaos, his vision narrowing into a dark, vibrating tunnel. This was the GLOC threshold, G-force-induced loss of consciousness. The blood was being crushed out of his brain and pooled in his legs, turning the world into a flickering, black-and-white silent movie. His trembling arms were pinned against his ribs by a weight equivalent to 5 times his own body mass. He knew the math. If he pulled back on the stick now, the Zeros would simply dive onto his tail and rake him from above. If he waited 2 seconds too long, the ocean would become a concrete wall. Behind him, the 3 Japanese pilots hesitated. In their training manuals at the Aki Air Base, American pilots were described as predictable. They relied on formation. They relied on high-altitude boom and zoom tactics. They didn't do this. They didn't commit to a vertical, terminal plunge with no apparent exit strategy. To the Zeros, Boyington didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man committing a very loud, very expensive suicide. They followed him, but they were cautious. They were fighting the air, too. The Zero was a master of the dogfight, light, nimble, and elegant, but in a straight-line dive at 500 knots, its control surfaces began to freeze. It was a butterfly chasing a falling brick. Boyington counted the seconds in his head, synchronized to the thumping of his own heart. 3, 2, 1. He hauled the stick back with every ounce of muscle left in his trembling frame. The pullout was so violent, it felt like the Corsair had hit a solid object. His teeth clapped together, drawing blood from his tongue. For a heartbeat, the world went pitch black. His heart couldn't pump against the force. He was flying blind, purely by the feel of the vibrations in his seat. Then the sky snapped back into place. The lead Zero had misjudged the pullout. Expecting the heavy Corsair to take longer to level off, the Japanese pilot had overshot. He flashed across Boyington's canopy like a silver blade, less than 50 yards away. Boyington didn't use his sights. He didn't have time to aim. In the blueprint of air combat, he performed what he called a placement shot. He anticipated the trajectory of the Zero and filled that space with lead. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber machine guns thundered in a single, gut-punching roar. The recoil was so immense it slowed the aircraft's forward momentum, the tracers stitching a diagonal line of white-hot phosphorus across the Zero's fuselage. The Japanese engine didn't just smoke, it disintegrated. The aircraft was torn in half by the sheer kinetic energy of the heavy American rounds. "One!" Boyington rasped. His voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. But the kill had been a gamble, and the house was calling in the dead. The Corsair's engine coughed, a dry, metallic sound that sent a jolt of ice down Boyington's spine. Cough, sputter, silence. The fuel lines were dry. Whatever vapor had been left in the tanks had been forced away from the intakes by the G-force of the pullout. The inertia was gone. The remaining two Zeros saw it immediately. The whistling death had gone quiet. This was the blueprint shift. The predator had just become the prey. The Zeros closed in, no longer circling, no longer patient. They saw a damaged, heavy American fighter at sea level with a windmilling propeller. It was the easiest kill of the war. Tracers began to stitch through the air around Boyington's canopy, smelling of cordite and ozone. The Corsair bucked as rounds found the wing root, tearing through the hydraulic lines. A warning light flared red on the dash. The oil pressure was flatlining. Boyington ignored the gauges. He ignored the fire. He even ignored the tremors in his hands. He was operating on a level of combat flow that few men ever reach. He rolled the heavy Corsair left, then snapped it right, forcing the Zeros to constantly adjust their deflection. He was hurting them, pulling them into a low-altitude fight where their nimbleness would be canceled out by the risk of hitting the water. One Zero, confident in his victory, slid into a perfect firing position off Boyington's right wing. He wasn't firing to kill yet. He was herding Boyington down toward the anti-aircraft guns of Rabaul. Boyington smiled, a thin, bloody expression. He snapped the Corsair into a climbing barrel roll, a maneuver that defied every rule of energy management for a plane with a dead engine. It was a physics-breaking move. The low Zero, caught off guard by the sudden vertical movement of a dead plane, overshot. Boyington rolled the Corsair inverted. He was hanging in his straps, looking up at the belly of the Zero. He squeezed the trigger. The second Zero took the burst directly through the cockpit floor. The canopy vanished in a cloud of splinters, and the aircraft rolled into a terminal spin, trailing a long, oily finger of smoke toward the Pacific. "Two," he muttered. But now the Corsair was finished. The surge of power was gone. The propeller stopped spinning entirely, coming to a dead halt in the wind. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rush of air over the cockpit glass. The last Zero stayed high. Its pilot was no longer aggressive. He was watching. He was waiting for the ocean to do what his guns couldn't. Boyington pushed the nose down, trading his final 500 feet of altitude for a few precious knots of airspeed. He was skimming the whitecaps now, so low that the salt spray was flecking his windscreen. He could see the individual crests of the waves, the deep, indifferent blue of the Pacific. The Zero finally dove for the mercy kill. Boyington waited. He watched the silver silhouette grow in his rearview mirror. Wait, wait, now! He hauled back on the spade grip, forcing the Corsair into a brutal, low-altitude snap turn. The Corsair shuddered, its stall warning horn screaming a final mournful note. The Zero, coming in too fast, overshot. Boyington pulled the trigger. Click. The guns were empty. No tracers, no recoil, just the sound of a firing pin hitting an empty chamber. The Zero pilot, startled by the sheer audacity of the move, didn't stay to fight. He pulled into a hard climb, choosing survival over vengeance. He left the Ghost to the water. Boyington was alone. He scanned the horizon, his jaw clenched so tight it felt like his teeth might crack. There was nothing but the endless, flat blue. No land, no rescue. Then a smudge, a dark, jagged line on the edge of the world. An island, or a hallucination brought on by withdrawal and hypoxia. He leveled the Corsair out, holding the heavy machine together with nothing but sheer will. He was a master of the long glide, calculating his descent to the inch. The wheels hit the water at 90 knots. The world exploded. The canopy shattered as the Corsair skipped across the surface like a flat stone. The first impact broke his ribs. The second impact sent his head into the gun sight. On the third, the Pacific rushed into the cockpit, a wall of green, freezing weight. Gregory Boyington tore himself free from the sinking wreck, clawing his way toward the light. He surfaced just in time to see the tail of his Corsair, the last of his fuel, his guns, and his war, slip beneath the waves. He floated in the vast silence of the Pacific, coughing up seawater, staring at an empty sky. To the Marines, he was missing in action. To the Japanese, he was a ghost finally laid to rest. But as he bobbed in the water, staring at the distant island of New Britain, Greg Boyington knew the truth. He had survived the math, and the legend of the black sheep was only just beginning. The Pacific did not rush to save him. It rushed to claim him. The water was colder than Boyington expected, a sharp, numbing shock that seized his muscles and stole what little breath he had left. His flight suit, once his second skin, had become an anchor. It was heavy with seawater, dragging him toward the deep. He kicked once, hard, then again, fighting the instinct to thrash. In a survival situation, panic is a fuel that burns your life away. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic kills. He forced his breathing into short, controlled pulls, each one tasting of salt and blood. The wreckage was already gone. The Corsair, his shield, his weapon, his last argument with the sky, had vanished completely, leaving only a widening stain of fuel and oil spreading across the surface like a bruise. Above him, the clouds drifted on, indifferent. No contrails, no aircraft, no witnesses. Boyington floated on his back and laughed once, a dry, broken sound that turned into a cough. The shaking came back immediately, worse than before. This was the dead space. His nervous system was finally free to collapse. Alcohol withdrawal does not care about heroics. It does not care about rank or medals or kills. It reduces men to animals. He clenched his fists until his fingernails bit into his palms, trying to use pain to ground himself. Stay conscious. If you sleep, you drown. The island he'd seen was real. New Britain lay to the northwest, its jungle-covered ridgelines barely visible through the haze. It was enemy territory, Rabaul's outer skin. If he reached it alive, he would simply trade one kind of death for another. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time in the open ocean is not a line, it's a circle. Then he heard it. Engines, not one, several. Boyington rolled onto his stomach, heart slamming against his ribs. The sound grew louder, resolving into a distinct, rhythmic thrum. Radial engines. Not zeros. These were deeper, slower. An Aichi E-13 Ekimenesomom. Jake float plane appeared, skimming low over the water, its twin pontoons slicing through the waves like surgical knives. The observer in the rear cockpit stood, pointing a gloved hand. Boyington didn't try to swim away. He didn't wave. He simply floated, arms spread, conserving what little strength he had left. If this was how the math ended, he would not beg for the solution. The float plane circled once, twice, banking steeply. A rope splashed into the water nearby. Hands reached down, rough, efficient, professional. They hauled him up like cargo, dragging his waterlogged body over the side of the pontoon. On the deck of the patrol craft, Boyington collapsed, retching seawater and bile. A rifle butt struck him between the shoulders, hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. Japanese voices shouted above him, sharp and excited. One of them bent down and pulled his head up by the hair. Boyington met his eyes. There was no triumph there, no hatred, just assessment, like a hunter examining a wolf that had fought far longer than expected. They knew exactly who he was. They had caught the Pirate King. At Marine Corps air stations across the Pacific, the news moved faster than confirmation ever could. Boyington missing. Presumed lost over Rabaul. For the men of VMF 214, the words hit like a body blow. The Black Sheep didn't process loss like normal squadrons. They were built around Boyington's gravity, his profanity-laced briefings, his brutal honesty, and his unorthodox tactics that kept them alive when doctrine failed. He was the axis their chaos rotated around. And now the axis was gone. Some refused to believe it. They looked at the empty chair in the mess hall and expected him to walk in, smelling of stale whiskey and gunpowder. Others drank harder. A few went quiet in a way that frightened the newer pilots. In the days that followed, Japanese radio propaganda seized the opportunity. Tokyo Rose crackled across the Pacific frequencies, describing the death of the notorious pirate leader, mocking the Americans for believing their drunken ace was invincible. They didn't say they had captured him. They wanted the myth dead. And for 20 months, the world believed them. Marine Command posthumously recommended Boyington for the Medal of Honor. His tally, 26 confirmed kills, was frozen in time. His name was carved into reports as a closed case. The war moved on, but Greg Boyington did not. He woke up in darkness. Not blackness, confined darkness. A space so small he could feel the walls without fully extending his arms. The air smelled of mildew, rust, and human waste. Every breath scraped his throat raw. This was the hole at Rabaul, a concrete box where the Japanese kept the high-value prisoners they wanted to break. His wrists were bound behind him, the circulation cut off until his fingers were numb stumps. His ribs screamed every time he shifted. At least 2 were broken from the crash or the beatings on the patrol boat. His head rang constantly, a dull, concussive echo that refused to fade. The door slid open. Light knifed in. A Japanese officer entered, immaculate uniform, sword at his side. He studied Boyington without speaking for a long time, then nodded to the guards. They dragged him out. Interrogation began immediately. They wanted confirmation, squadron designations, aircraft numbers, base locations, tactics, names. Boyington gave them nothing, not out of traditional heroism, but out of spite. He insulted them in broken Japanese he'd picked up in the pre-war years. He laughed at their questions. He played the dumb drunk role, then answered incorrectly just to watch the interrogators correct him. The beatings followed. They weren't theatrical. They were methodical, professional. Weeks blurred into months. He was moved from Rabaul to Truk, then to the infamous Ofuna camp in Japan. Each transport felt like a slow erasure. Less food, more isolation, longer stretches without sunlight. His weight plummeted from 170 pounds to barely 110. His teeth loosened in his gums from scurvy. His hands, once steady enough to place bullets into a moving cockpit, shook constantly now, not from withdrawal but from starvation. And yet he survived. He survived by replaying the sky. In the dark of his cell, he would close his eyes and fly. He replayed the dive over Rabaul, the shots, the moments where death had passed him by inches. He ran the math over and over until it became a mantra. I beat the odds once. I can beat them again. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Boyington didn't hear the announcement on a radio. He felt it in the atmosphere. The violence drained out of the air like pressure leaving a ruptured hull. The guards changed first. Their posture softened. Their voices lost their edge. Days later, the camp gates at Amori were literally torn down. American troops stood there, stunned. Out of the shadows stepped a man who shouldn't have existed. Gregory Pappy Boyington stepped forward. Thin, scarred, bearded, but alive. A ghost walking out of history. When he returned home, the country didn't know what to do with him. They gave him the Medal of Honor. They gave him parades. They gave him a book deal. But they did not give him peace. He was a man built for the edge of survival, for the quiet second before the kill. Peacetime had no use for his instincts. The bottle found him again. Fame sharpened his contradictions instead of smoothing them. He became a celebrity, but he remained a misfit. But the war had already written its verdict. Gregory Boyington was not a hero because he was clean. He was a hero because he was effective. He took a group of black sheep, men the military had discarded, and turned them into the most feared squadron in the Pacific. He flew with nothing left in the tank, physically, mentally, and mechanically, and still found a way to win. Over Rabaul, when the math said he should die, he rewrote the equation. The sky remembers men like that, and so does history. The sky over the northern Solomons did not change after Boyington disappeared. It remained brutally consistent, bright, empty, and unforgiving. What changed was how American pilots flew through it. VMF-214 didn't slow down after Rabaul. They became sharper, meaner, less forgiving of mistakes. Boyington had trained them to think of air combat not as a duel, but as a transaction. One fast exchange, one outcome, then separation. If the exchange took longer than 10 seconds, something had gone wrong. Now, without him in the air, the squadron began executing that philosophy with a kind of collective fury. They flew as if every engagement might be their last, because for Boyington, it had been. Japanese pilots noticed the difference almost immediately. Intercepts that once turned into swirling dogfights now ended abruptly. Corsairs would dive from altitude, fire short, surgical bursts, then vanish back into cloud or sun glare before defensive turns could even begin. Pilots wrote of American fighters that refused to be drawn into battle, aircraft that behaved less like adversaries and more like weapons being deployed and withdrawn. The war was becoming asymmetrical in the air. Boyington had never cared about fair fights. He cared about outcomes. At Japanese airfields surrounding Rabaul, briefings grew longer and quieter. Veterans spoke less. New pilots listened more. Maps were redrawn. Altitude bands adjusted. Patrol routes shifted. The Americans were no longer expected to climb with discipline or wait for formations. They attacked when it suited them, from directions that made no doctrinal sense. One Japanese flight leader wrote that the Corsair had become a predator that does not announce itself. Another noted that American pilots no longer chased damaged aircraft down to the sea. If a burst failed to kill, they disengaged and reset, preserving altitude and advantage instead of pride. That behavior was unsettling. It suggested confidence. Worse, it suggested restraint. Back at Marine Command, the absence of Boyington created a different kind of tension. Officially, he was still listed as missing. Unofficially, many assumed he was dead. The paperwork moved forward anyway. Commendations, reports, tactical summaries. But there was an unspoken problem. The very man who had caused so many headaches before Rabaul had left behind a system that worked too well to dismantle. The black sheep were producing results: high kill ratios, low losses, aggressive sorties that disrupted Japanese schedules and forced constant defensive scrambling. The brass didn't like the culture Boyington had fostered, but they liked the numbers, so they let it continue. In Japanese captivity, Boyington had no way of knowing any of this, but the rhythm of war reached him anyway. He felt it in the guards' behavior, in the tension that crept into routine, in the sudden relocations and tightening security, in the way interrogators stopped asking questions and started waiting for answers they already believed they had. They did not treat him like a pilot anymore. They treated him like a symbol. He was moved again, this time deeper into Japan. The transport was cramped, unheated, and silent, except for the breathing of other prisoners packed together in darkness. No one spoke. Speech wasted energy. Energy was survival. At each stop, guards checked his face against papers. Some stared longer than necessary. Word had traveled. The pirate king had not vanished cleanly. He had left scars. Meanwhile, in the air, the Pacific campaign accelerated toward its next phase. American aircraft numbers surged. Japanese replacements thinned. Fuel shortages forced shorter patrols. Training hours dropped to dangerous levels. The sky filled with young men who had learned theory without experience. Against that backdrop, Boyington's influence became more pronounced, not because his name was invoked, but because his approach matched the new reality. Speed mattered more than elegance. Surprise mattered more than formation integrity. Survival depended on refusing prolonged engagements. Air combat was no longer personal, it was procedural. The irony was brutal. Boyington, who had always fought against structure, had accidentally created one. Not a hierarchy, but a mindset. One that valued decisiveness over valor, math over mythology. And that mindset continued doing its work without him. As American forces pressed closer to the Philippines, Japanese pilots began reporting Corsair encounters with a strange resignation. They no longer described individual aces. They described patterns, fast dives, short bursts, clean disengagements, no hesitation. The sky had learned a new language. Boyington, stripped of sky and speed and choice, measured time differently. Days were counted by meals, meals by hunger, hunger by pain. But at night, when the camp settled into uneasy quiet, he still flew. He replayed the geometry, the angles, the mistakes he'd made and the ones he hadn't. He refined them in his head, as if preparing for another sortie that might never come. That discipline, mental, not physical, kept him alive. Because as long as he was still thinking like a pilot, he was not finished. The war was not done with Gregory Boyington, not yet, and neither was the sky. The first thing captivity stripped from Boyington was not his freedom, it was his sense of tempo. In the air, time had always been elastic. Seconds stretched into lifetimes during a dive. Entire fights ended in less time than it took to draw a breath. Even boredom had a rhythm. The long transit to target, the tight coil of anticipation before contact. In captivity, there was only waiting. Waiting for food that might not come. Waiting for guards whose moods could shift without warning. Waiting for questions that had already been asked 100 times and would be asked again, as if repetition itself might grind truth loose. The Japanese did not interrogate him constantly. That would have been inefficient. Instead, they let silence do the work. Days passed without speech. Then suddenly, without explanation, he would be dragged from his cell, marched down corridors that smelled of damp concrete and old sweat, and seated under a bare bulb that hummed faintly overhead. The same officer would enter. The same folder would open. The questions never changed. Aircraft types, numbers, bases, tactics. Boyington never answered them. Sometimes he lied badly, on purpose. Sometimes he pretended confusion. Sometimes he stared at the wall until the blows came. He learned quickly that pain was not the real weapon. Deprivation was. Hunger. Isolation. The slow erosion of certainty. The guards were not cruel in the way propaganda promised. They were colder than that, efficient, detached. Violence was applied only when it served a purpose. They did not beat him out of anger. They beat him to remind him of where he was in the equation. He responded the only way he knew how, by refusing to collapse. As weeks turned into months, his body became a problem he had to manage. Starvation hollowed him out. Muscles shrank. Joints stiffened. His weight dropped until his uniform hung on him like it belonged to someone else. His hands shook constantly, not with withdrawal anymore, but with weakness. Simple movements became calculations. If I stand too fast, I fall. If I fall, I don't get back up. He rationed his energy the way he once rationed altitude. Every action had to pay for itself. No wasted motion, no wasted anger. At night, when sleep came in broken fragments, he dreamed of engines cutting out, of dives that never ended, of tracers climbing toward him from the sea like angry fingers. He woke each time with his heart racing, lungs burning, convinced for a split second that he was back over Rabaul, that the ocean was rushing up again. Then the smell returned. Mold, sweat, rot. Reality reasserted itself. The Japanese understood exactly who he was. They did not call him by his name. They referred to him by reputation, sometimes by nickname, sometimes not at all. To them, he was not an individual pilot. He was a data point, a proof of concept, an American who fought differently. They were less interested in his squadron than in his thinking, how he chose angles, why he disengaged when advantage was incomplete, Why he refused to turn when turning was expected. These were not idle questions. The Japanese air arm was adapting under catastrophic pressure. Losses were mounting. Veterans were dying faster than they could be replaced. Any insight, any fracture in American doctrine was valuable. Boyington gave them nothing useful, but he listened, and what he heard told him everything he needed to know about the war outside. The questions became less confident. Interrogators began referencing engagements he recognized, places, dates, formations he knew had ended badly for Japan. They asked about aircraft they had not encountered before, about numbers that suggested American production was outpacing their worst estimates. He never smiled, but inside something hardened. The enemy was losing, and they knew it. Transfers followed. Each one was worse than the last. Cramped holds, open-air pens, camps where prisoners were packed together so tightly that sleep required coordination. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, malaria, infections that turned small cuts into death sentences. Boyington watched men give up, not dramatically, quietly. They stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped responding. He learned to recognize the signs and turned away from them. Sympathy was dangerous. Attachment led to loss, and loss drained strength. Survival required focus. At night, he flew. He replayed every fight he could remember. He rebuilt them frame by frame. He imagined variations, what he could have done differently, what he would do next time. It was not hope, it was maintenance. Occasionally, the guards made mistakes. A comment slipped. A newspaper left within sight. A radio broadcast overheard from another building. Fragments, island names, landings, losses. The war was moving closer to Japan. That knowledge was both comfort and threat. As defeat loomed, captors grew unpredictable. Discipline frayed, resentment sharpened. Prisoners were no longer just assets. They were reminders. Boyington's health deteriorated further. His vision blurred in low light. His ribs never healed correctly. His teeth loosened. Infections lingered. He coughed constantly, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the barracks at night. Still, he refused to die, not out of optimism, out of defiance. If the Japanese wanted him erased, they would have to work harder. By early 1945, the camp atmosphere shifted again. Air raids became audible. Distant at first, then closer. The ground trembled sometimes, just faintly, under the weight of American bombs falling miles away. Guards listened to the sky more than the prisoners now. Food became scarcer, tempers shorter, orders harsher. Boyington understood the pattern. Pressure was increasing on all sides, and pressure always led to mistakes. He did not know how the war would end. He did not know if he would live to see it. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had already outlived every expectation placed on him by his commanders, by his enemies, and by the mathematics of war itself. The equation was not finished, and neither was he. The end did not arrive with a trumpet blast or a flag. It arrived quietly. One morning, the guards did not shout as loudly. The beatings stopped without explanation. Orders were delivered in clipped phrases that sounded rehearsed, as if the men giving them were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Radios were taken away. Paperwork vanished. Officers who had once strode through the compound with rigid certainty now avoided eye contact. Something had broken. Boyington felt it before he understood it. The air inside the camp changed, not with relief, but with uncertainty, the kind that follows the collapse of a system that no longer knows who is in charge. At night, the distant thunder grew louder. Bombs fell closer now, sometimes close enough to rattle the walls, close enough that dust drifted from the rafters and settled on the prisoners' shoulders like ash. The guards listened to the sky with the same tension Boyington had once felt, waiting for enemy fighters to break through cloud cover. The hunters were overhead. The hunted were listening. In August 1945, the war finally reached the camp gates. Not with violence, with absence. One morning, the guards simply didn't return. Their barracks stood open. Rifles leaned against walls untouched. Boots sat neatly beneath bunks as if their owners had stepped out for a moment and never come back. The prisoners waited. Hours passed. Then footsteps, different ones. American boots. The gate was forced open. The sound of it, metal tearing free from metal, echoed through the compound like a gunshot. Boyington stood among men who looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, skeletal, alive by stubbornness alone. When the first American officer stepped inside, he froze, staring at the scene as if his brain refused to process it. Someone asked a question. Someone laughed. Someone cried. Boyington didn't do any of those things. He just stood there, steadying himself, the way he had always done before a fight. Recovery did not happen quickly. Bodies heal slowly when they have been starved of everything that makes healing possible. Bones knit, lungs clear, strength returns in fragments. The shaking never fully stops. Not for men who have lived that close to collapse for that long. Doctors talked, officers asked questions, paperwork piled up. Boyington listened without interrupting. They told him the war was over. They told him he was presumed dead for nearly 2 years. They told him his name had been spoken in past tense. He absorbed it all the same way he had absorbed everything else, with a kind of detached focus that made people uneasy. Survival had taught him something that celebration could not undo. When the noise stops, the silence doesn't disappear. It just waits. The world he returned to wanted a simpler story. They wanted a hero who fit cleanly into a sentence. They wanted medals to explain the cost. They wanted victory to feel neat. Boyington did not offer them that. He accepted the honors because refusing them would have required more energy than he had. The Medal of Honor rested on his chest, heavy and impersonal. Applause washed over him. Cameras flashed. None of it sounded like an engine. None of it felt like altitude. What mattered had already happened. Over the Pacific, in a stretch of sky where mistakes killed instantly and hesitation was fatal, Gregory Boyington had forced a change. Not with elegance, not with discipline, but with refusal. He refused to fly the war the way it was supposed to be flown. He refused to turn fair fights into shared graves. He refused to die when the numbers said he should. And in doing so, he left behind something more durable than reputation. He left behind a way of surviving. The air war did not become safer because of him. It became colder, more exact, less forgiving of error. That shift saved lives at a cost few wanted to examine too closely. Boyington never claimed to be a model officer. He never claimed to be stable. He never claimed to be anything other than what he was, a man who functioned best when the margin for error was razor thin and the consequences were immediate. In the sky, that made him lethal. On the ground, it made him difficult. History tends to smooth those edges. This story does not, because wars are not won by clean men. They are won by men who keep flying when they should already be dead, by men who survive the math. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington did that, over Rabaul, over the Pacific, and through captivity that erased better men. The war ended, the sky moved on. But for a moment in history, when the air was full of tracers and the odds were stacked toward annihilation, one unstable, self-destructive pilot bent the equation just far enough to live. And that was enough.